The Louisville Cardinals have the pieces on the roster to have one of the best offensive line units in the ACC, but the big question is, will they? It's complex. We'll break it down on today's episode of Locked On Louisville.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, welcome into this Thursday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. As always, want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the show free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. We continue into our position previews, ending the offensive side of the ball on today's episode. For the offensive line talk, I brought on a former collegiate offensive lineman. He is the producer and talent from the Pink Seats podcast on the State of Louisville Network. That's Keith Arutoff. Keith, welcome to the show for the first time, my man. What's going on?
Oh, thank you for having me on. Just still getting settled in, just moved to Louisville about a month ago. So getting established in the city and enjoying every step of it.
Heck yeah, man. Keith is finally a Louisvillian. We love to hear that. If you all don't know, like I said, from the Pink Seats podcast, Jacob Lane has been on the show, really good friend of mine. He's been on the show a countless amount of times. So I'm just going to get everyone from that podcast on this show at some point. But Keith, with your expertise on the offensive line, I was like, Jacob, I need him on this show today. And he's like, dude, he's all yours. So glad to talk a little shop with Keith. We'll discuss how Louisville has the pieces, but it's a little bit more complex in terms of whether they'll be the ACC's best. Projected depth chart. We'll predict the depth chart in the second segment. At the end, we'll talk about some potential rotation surprises and much more. Keith, last season, Louisville overhauled the offensive line right after the spring game, and the Cardinals were pretty solid up front. Now, they did deal with some injuries. Renato Brown went down halfway through the year. Brian Hudson played all year injured, it seemed like, but Willie Tyler was great. Michael Gonzalez, Eric Miller at certain points. You have to completely almost rebuild it again. You bring back two starters, but you're going to have to replace a lot of the production. So just how challenging is it from a meshing standpoint to get an entire offensive line to mesh when you have probably about half the guys are new to this team?
So that was what I was going to add into that, was that a lot of it, normally if they're guys who have been in the system year over year, they do a lot of work rotating guys in. So you're working together with new combinations during the offseason to try and ease that sort of pain. But with the approach to recruiting that Jeff Brom's taken in recent years, you're not getting that benefit. You're not being able to work with a guy for a couple of years before starting. So it can be incredibly tricky trying to work with someone brand new, trying to learn, okay, if we're stretch run to the right and you're okay, how far is his jab step to the right before he starts taking off field? How long is this guy going to chip before he moves to the next level? It's a lot of intricacies that get worked on during the offseason that they're really going to have to speed run through to be clicking by the time the season opens up.
Does it help that the pretty much every guy that they brought in are veterans to an extent? I mean, these guys have all played a good amount of college football in their career. Having that, seasoned experience, how much does that play a factor into sort of getting things to cohesively mesh quicker than they would if you had to rely on true freshmen or guys that hadn't played a ton?
So that is one of the pros, that you're bringing in a lot of experience who have done this before. I know, like Jonathan Mendoza, I believe, is one of the only ones who didn't previously play at a power conference. I mean, he was in the Ivy League, so he's not necessarily going to be slow in the film room or learning how the O-line actually works. So for lack of a better term, they're professionals. So they know what they're doing. They're going to come in. They're veterans. They can pick up things quicker than some freshman who maybe spent a year pouting on the sidelines at another program because he wasn't getting playing time he thought he was going to get.
Mm-hmm. Now, to me, and you have a little bit more of an expertise to this than I do, but it feels like the guys, Michael Gonzalez is a stud. I mean, he's been with this program very little, or very rarely, I should correct myself to saying that you don't always see a guy that's performing early on and just continues to do so through his career. He's sort of a rare breed. And not to mention, it's great to hear the news that Renato Brown is close to 100%, because I thought that he was great on the interior on that right side before he went down against Pittsburgh. Having both of those guys back, and then Monroe Mills was one of the better tackles in the portal. Pete Nygra, one of the best centers in the portal. It feels like from an individual standpoint, now it obviously has to all come together, but looking at the roster, looking at the room, I look at the pieces and I'm like, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but if things click like we believe that they should, I feel like we're looking at one of the better offensive line units in the conference.
And a lot of what the guys that they brought in, what they do well is pass block. So like, I go through and I was watching the tape on the guys as we pick up the commitments coming out of the transfer portal. And I had a similar knock on a few of them coming in. It's like, I don't know if this guy really is I wouldn't call them bulldozers in the run game, but pass blocking, they're fantastic. You go back, you watch Monroe Mills. I feel like the only game where I would really say he struggled last season was against Texas. And a
lot of talent on that defensive line, too.
Exactly. So, you gave up a sack against Texas. You know what? They didn't make the national championship game. They made the national championship playoff.
Right.
Pretty darn good. So I think if the offense sort of shifts its philosophy around, and there's some good data out there. If you look up, like last year, Jeff Brom passed the ball less than he had
ever
any year previously.
Yeah.
So if we see a shift back towards the type of offense we're used to seeing from Jeff Brom coached teams, this is an offensive line that could be stellar this season in doing what the team needs them to do.
You can argue that the two most important positions on the line are left tackle and center, obviously. It feels like I felt weird saying you could argue that. It feels like that's almost like a universal truth, unless you just find somebody that wants to be difficult or play one of the other positions. But I digress. Louisville made it a point of emphasis because I feel like they have players at those positions that, if they saw the proper development, could rise maybe into those spots. But they made it a point of emphasis to go out and really swing for the fences with the players at that position, getting Mills, Pete Nygra, who was one of the best centers in the MAC, but still one of the best centers overall in the portal. How high does that raise your ceiling when you get players that are that quality at both of those spots?
Oh, it's huge. And something that a lot of fans take for granted, and it's one of the things that I like the most about Pete Nygra's game, is that he's a consistent snapper of the football. And you may chuckle or think that's silly, but you go back and ask Alabama what it's like to have a center that can't get a snap on target every single time. You'll see that fourth down against Michigan. It potentially cost them a trip to the championship game. So to go a little inside baseball, we were texting a little bit to talk about, what are some of the topics we're going to talk? And one of the things was like, what's going to be the most important position? And like you said, a lot of people are going to normally default to, left tackle, because it's the blindside blocker. And I'm more leaning on the fence of, like, I think Pete Nygra at center having to step in, feel the shoes of Brian Hudson, who was absolutely stellar and played through significant injury last year. That's a big hole to fill. Either way, the argument, you're replacing someone who got signed to an NFL roster. So to take a merry excursion back to the question that was asked, absolutely huge. And it really raises the bar on what you can do as an offense by having solid veteran talent that you can trust as the anchor on the left side and in the center of the line, guiding the inside O lineman.
Last question before we both predict the starting offensive line. You look at both of the units from last year, this year. You mentioned that you replaced Brian Hudson. I mean, his value cannot even be, it can't be quantified. I mean, it was absolutely tremendous. He was a multiple year starter. Thankfully, it looks like Pete Nygra is going to fit what Louisville needs. When you look at this room from what they've lost, how did these two collective groups sort of stand up to each other? What do you feel like this unit might do a little bit better than last year's? What are you kind of worrying about? Is it definitely run blocking here? What's kind of the focus?
So what they could potentially do better, and I also feel like this might just be because they're going to have more opportunities to do it, is protect in the passing game. I never thought that last year pass blocking was an issue for the O-line, but I feel like if it's not going to be better, that should be consistent year over year. I love the tackles that we got on the outside, the veteran presence on the inside with Nygra directing traffic in the passing game. Very confident in that. The run game is where I'm not going to say I'm hitting the panic button, but it leaves me a little concerned. And I'm curious what type of adjustments we're going to make to our run game if we're going to keep running sort of a stretch run scheme as opposed to trying to bully guys up and down the field. Because not just replacing Brian Hudson on the inside, we're also playing against 4 of, I believe, the 5 best graded interior defensive linemen via Pro Football Focus. Like Kentucky, they've got a phenomenal D tackle, Clemson, Notre Dame, Miami. That's a murderer's row of beef on the inside of the line. So it's going to be a tall task to try and run the ball this year.
It definitely is. And I think you mentioned, if you didn't mention, I was going to. What we saw last year, it so much of an outlier in terms of, deviation between throwing and running the ball. They ran the ball so much more than Brom has ever usually done. So I hate to say that a lot of that was because of the issue at quarterback, but
you're not wrong.
Let's call it how we see it, and not to hurt that Louisville was like the only team that had both 2 running backs go to the combine and both of those guys get drafted. So when we come back, we're going to both predict what the starting offensive line is going to be for the Cardinals coming up after we tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Today's episode of the show brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. Unfortunately, we're sort of in that time between the end of basketball and the start of football where the sports aren't sporting like I want them to. No disrespect to baseball, big baseball fan, but that's all that's going on at the moment. Thankfully, there are the Olympics, but nonetheless, FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. I've been betting on a lot of MLB with the profit boosts that they have at your disposal. You can definitely maximize the value of the odds. Head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And heading into the second segment of this Thursday edition of Locked on Louisville with the producer and I will say on-air talent from the Pink Seats podcast, Keith Arutoff. Keith, let's sort of break down what the starting rotation is going to look like. I feel like we're probably going to agree on most of these. Monroe Mills starting at left tackle, Pete Nygra starting at center. I feel like we both can agree on left guard. I would assume you would have Michael Gonzalez in that role as well.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so pretty easy look. Nothing too painful. Right guard, it feels like Renato Brown, if he's healthy, feels like the obvious choice at that spot.
So, and I'm with you. If he comes back, he's healthy, he's not missing a step, I would expect him to be able to step into that role and fill back into the starting position. A player I was impressed, though, with spring ball, and we'll talk a bit more about him as we get into sort of the 8-9 deep on the offensive line, Austin Collins. I think if Renato Brown's not quite at 100% to start the season, especially playing Austin Peay or Jacksonville State. Maybe we see Austin Collins start a couple of games at that right guard spot. He stepped up last year, and for a player as young as he is, he's played pretty well. I've been impressed with him. And before the spring, I was talking with some of the Pink Seats guys about he might contend with Pete for the starting center job as well.
That's what I was thinking. I was wondering what that was going to look like. It feels like the transition to guard is in the cards for the Cardinals. No pun intended, or maybe pun intended. Hell, I don't know. Getting Vic Cutler from Ohio State feels like more of a move to addressing that backup center spot. At the right tackle, are you going Mendoza like me?
Yeah, leaning towards Jonathan Mendoza. That appeared to be what it was going to be in the spring game. He looked good out there. I mean, that type of size is just overwhelming, and he moves himself very well. Another player who I thought really good pass blocker. And again, another guy where it's like, it's not quite a bulldozer in the run game, but if we're running a stretch zone or just a zone run scheme in general, he can make a hole.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. That's kind of where I went with this as well. It felt like the starting lineup. Gosh, I'm in basketball mode.
Pat Kelsey's got you excited.
Yeah, shout out to Coach PK, by the way. The starting five up front in the trenches feels like you're not going to get a ton of disagreements amongst conversation, but I do think it's interesting. I wanted to talk about the two deep as well. I wanted to go a little bit further to see, what about the backups? And it feels like left tackle is one of those spots that you could see a couple different players to slide in on. So to you, who's that backup in the blindside role for the Cardinals?
So when I go through a two deep, especially on the offensive line, I don't necessarily assign one individual position to a player. Versatility, okay. If you're not a starter on the offensive line, versatility is your best friend to get onto the field as quick as possible or in the optimal situations. Sure. I'm leaning, whether it be right or left side, if something were to happen or if a tackle were to go down, I think Trevante Sylvester is going to be the guy who steps up and into that role. Another guy who saw some play last year, not a ton, but looked solid when he was on the field. And he's someone who's been in this system for multiple years now, who this coaching staff can lean and rely on.
I think that there were a lot of worries about whether or not all the Houston guys were going to go to the portal. Like we got the commitment from Ruben Unije, and then he goes back to the portal. And I think it was Lance Robinson that ended up entering and then taking his name out, or maybe it was Sylvester. I thought it was Robinson that ended up.
I believe you're correct that there were concerns about Lance Robinson hopping in.
Such a weird time. Dude, the transfer portal makes everything just so weird because you're recruiting your roster every single season. But I digress. I do think it's very interesting because I guess I've thought of it that way, but not as often as I should in terms of the versatility, as a backup. And, being able to play multiple spots, because it feels like some of these guys sort of fill those roles of multiple spots. Like Vic Cutler can play multiple spots, Austin Collins. One name that I want to ask you about is Rasheed Miller, the transfer that we haven't brought up, the tackle from Georgia Southern, veteran guy. Where does he sort of play in the pecking order here for Brahms' offensive line?
So that was one that I was kind of curious about, because looking at what Brahms' strategy was coming into spring ball, he brought in, I think it was 3 or 4 offensive tackles, all with 1 year of eligibility remaining. And as someone who doesn't work for the team, I thought it's like, so we're just basically having open tryouts at the 2 tackle spots. And then it's like, hey, if you come in, you don't get a job and you're not happy about where you're at, you can hit the spring window and try to pursue an opportunity at another school. And maybe that's what happened with Ruben. I don't know. But when it looked like it was going to be Mendoza and Mills as the 2 starting tackles, I kind of expected Miller to go the same way to pursue another opportunity, as I think this was his last year.
Man. It was really weird. I was like, thankfully he's staying. But
depth, you can never have too much depth at the tackle spots. So while I think Trevante Sylvester will be the first tackle off the bench to sub in, these guys get tired. I wouldn't be shocked, and I believe Jeff had mentioned it in media availability, that they're actually going to try and go with the rotation of O-linemen during games as well to try and keep guys fresh. It's nothing I ever did in my playing days, but hey, the game changes, people innovate, things happen. So maybe that's something you want to do. I think of the run blocking ability of the transfers that were brought in, I was most optimistic about Rasheed Miller's. Maybe they have some overload packages where they bring in an extra tackle and put Rasheed at the tight end spot and have him try to block on the goal line or something like that. You can get creative with the big guys to utilize them and get them on the field in ways that can be advantageous for the offense. So I'm glad we have them, and I'm curious to see how we use them.
I am as well. Are there any other names? We brought up Sylvester, Lance Robinson, Austin Collins, and just Rasheed Miller. Are there any other names that you feel like, yeah, this guy is for certain going to be a guy that gets some meaningful snaps this fall?
Well, I don't know about certainty, but he was in the 2 deep in spring ball, and hey, this will be a name that'll get a pop. It's really good for the social algorithms. Madden Sanker. He got some 2 reps during spring ball at one of the guard positions, and then he also got some time at the center position in spring ball as well. So it seems to me like he's working on that versatility to where he can slide in at guard or center if need be. I don't know if he's going to get in the heart of the schedule when we're in that long stretch of consecutive ACC games. But if things go how us as Louisville fans expect things to go against an Austin Peay or against a Jacksonville State, I wouldn't be shocked to see him get some rotation time and to get some play in those games earlier if we can get a game in conference play out of hand potentially.
Keith, I agree, and I'm glad that you brought up Madden because he's a name that a lot of Louisville fans want to see on the field because of the recruiting rankings and just the social media clout and stuff like that. But in the next segment, I do want to sort of identify some potential surprises. Who are some names that we might not be talking about but could ultimately find their way onto the field in a significant capacity this fall? We'll discuss who those players might be coming up after the break. And into the final segment of this episode of Locked On Louisville. Thanks again for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week. Your team every day. Wrapping the show up with my friend Keith Arutoff, former all-pro, all-world collegiate offensive lineman and all-pro, all-world producer and on-air talent from the Pink Seats podcast. I don't care what Jacob says about you, man. You're doing a great job. Keith, it doesn't feel like there are many names outside the ones that we've primarily discussed that, you could think, yeah, I can see this guy, rising up into contention for playing spots. Now, part of that is due to, it feels like Brahms high school recruiting has been geared towards taking more diamond in the rough guys that can develop into the players you want them to be because of how they're treating the portal. So you've got a handful of freshmen that probably aren't ready to come in right away. You have some younger guys as well. Is there a player or a couple players that you see on this team that you feel like might have those tools to surprise a lot of people this fall?
Well, first I'll advise, be careful when you talk about the high school recruiting. I made the mistake of kicking that hornet's nest on Twitter about a week ago, and I think my mentions just now stopped going off in the replies to that. So with regards to surprises, I don't know if you're going to see a guy like a Joe Crocker or a Ransom McDermott be ready to go just because those sort of things take time. And also the trenches are arguably the one place on the football where being a fully grown man is going to be the biggest advantage. Like one of the jokes I make on Pink Seed is puberty is nature's best PED. And you can't expect to throw an 18, 19-year-old in there against 22, 23, 24, 25-year-old men and expect good things to happen. So I don't think we're going to have any like 9 or 10 out of 10 grade surprises. Some of the things that I think could be a little surprising, but more in the realm of realism is say Renato Brown is still slow to recover, or if he's looking a little tentative on that knee, I wouldn't be shocked to see Austin Collins hop in that position and basically make the coaches take him out, because he played very well in role last year. And I think he even saw some play the year before that. He's a very experienced player for being only a redshirt junior. So Austin Collins is a guy, and while we're talking about the youth, the hot button name, say we have some bad luck on the inside of the O-line. We see a few guys go down. I think Lance Robinson's probably going to be that number 2 guy to step up. That's not surprising, but I wouldn't be shocked if Madden Sanker made the jump and was able to get over Vic Cutler, depending on where it is on the season, to be that next guy in line on the inside of the offensive line. He's working on his versatility. He can snap the ball now. We already knew he was a good guard prospect. It looks like he's been putting in work on the strength and conditioning program. He looks like he's leaned up a little bit since he got on campus, put on a little more muscle mass. And who knows, if duty calls, I wouldn't be shocked to see him thrown into action this year.
What do you think the main hurdle or obstacle is for Madden in terms of his player development? That's kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say holding him back, because he's had to play behind Michael Gonzalez and Renato Brown last season. This is his second season. What do you think is the thing that you want to see him improve on personally to get to a spot to where when/if his number is called, he's ready to be an enforcer on the interior?
I mean, just that sort of meanness. So Jeff Brom has been recruiting in the high school ranks, watching the film on some of the recent commits and one recent decommit. A lot of what I'm seeing on their tape is a sort of edge to them. They're blocking until the whistle. They get a guy in the dirt, they let him get halfway to get up, and then they put him in the dirt again. Like that sort of roughhousing play that's sort of on that line. And so just speaking as an offensive lineman, a player who I tried to model my game after, and I got to preface, strictly on the field, Richie Incognito. Absolutely love the way he plays on the field, because he's that type of guy who it can physically use his physicality to get in a player's head. So not only is he actually succeeding in running the game, he's also taking the defender out of the game, where it's like, oh, he has an opportunity to make a play, but instead he's going to take that time to try and get a shot on me because I've been on his case. So what I'd love to see Madden do, well, obviously strength and training, more puberty, get bigger, get stronger, but get meaner. Like those interior offensive line guys, you got to be mean, man. And we've had too many nice guys. Like Brian Hudson, he looks like a 30-year cop on the force. I've known the kid since he was about 11, 12 years old. He's a softie.
Are you okay?
Let me help you up. Oh, come on. Let me help you up, buddy.
Oh, man. Hey, man. You imagine if he had, obviously he has that dog in him. Imagine if he was like a real mean dude with how good he already is. Bro's turning into the best center in NFL history with that.
I'm so excited to see what he can do, coached by Dan Campbell and in that sort of Detroit scheme. Like, I don't think there's a natural better fit player to a team for like undrafted free agents for Louisville than Brian Hudson to Detroit. I think he's going to thrive there.
I want to see. I'm excited to see him healthy again, man. I commend him for being able to play. Because here's the thing about it is, if you didn't know he was battling injury, you weren't going to know. Like, you had to be like, I was told halfway through the year, like, hey, man, Brian's battling an injury, but he's going to tough it out is what he's told the staff. And he did that. And, it looked like he never showed it. And that's props to, just how much of a dog he is internally. But hopefully we have more Brian Hudson-esque minded players coming up through the ranks. Keith, appreciate you hopping on the show to talk offensive line. You're a lifesaver, man. As I told him before, I understand the offensive line, but when it comes to like being able to, articulate the intricacies of it with the correct terminology to where somebody who knows offensive line would watch my show and be like, dude, just stop. I'm glad to have you on, man. Definitely will have you on in the future as football gets closer. Over the weekend, we're going to transition to the defensive side of the ball to start those position previews. But that is going to wrap up this Thursday edition of Locked On Louisville. Everyone have a great day. Have a great start to the weekend. We'll see you right back here very soon.